Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. Today is Thursday, February 6th. Why is it February? I have no idea. I am Dr. Tanji Marshall. I am the CEO and the principal consultant of Liaison Educational Partners, where we strive to make sure educational entities basically become who they say they are. How do we do that? We do that through a focus on curriculum, instruction, and culture. And we do all of that by looking through the lens of power. And every time I come here, I come on a Thursday. Thursday is important because it's a day where my family stops and gets together on a family chat. And we ask ourselves and remind ourselves, what are we thankful for? So on this Thankful Thursday, I am actually thankful that last night the four of us got together with my grandson and we just hung out together on FaceTime. That sounds really simple, but in a time and in a world where there's so much strife and bifurcation, the small moments of being able to spend time with your family, even though it was digital and remote, it still brought joy to my heart. So, what are you thankful for today? Take a moment to really think about that. Well, we're back, and this week there's been so much going on in the world, and I like to come to this space and really talk about the power through educational spaces and do it in a way that operationalize it. There's a lot of conversation about shifting the power dynamics and making sure that power is distributed evenly and equitably, but there's not as much conversation around what does power look like. And so, with all that's going on with the threat to civil liberties and the threat to historical accuracy, I thought I would begin a series called The Power in History. A lot of times we talk about the power is history, but there's a lot of power in history. And I do not take the fact that this is February and this is Black History Month for granted. I know the history of Black History Month, and I know it's important for us to get as much in this time period as possible because what Black history is all about is completely under threat. And so I want to take some time and really break down some critical aspects of history so that we can contextualize where we are in our American construct right now. And Benjamin Franklin was asked, well, they all were asked, all the founding members were asked, did we have a democracy or a republic? What did we have? And Ben Franklin came back and he said, you have a republic if you can keep it. And we are asking ourselves some very important questions right now about whether or not we can keep this republic that we've got going on. So I'm going to spend the next few moments really sharing some of my own thoughts about the power in history. So let's get started. So let's move to the next piece of this and really bring up, first of all, I always ask you, do you have your copy of my book, Understanding Your Instructional Power? It is a game changer. I just heard from an educational leader and the person said, Dr. Marshall's book has forced meaningful conversation and made us take a step back looking at our instruction. Came from a coach in the North Carolina area. And they talked about one of the critical aspects of our focus, which is instruction. And so really excited about that. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to get the book. You can scan that QR code. And later on in our time, I'll give you a way to get a signed copy of the book as well. So what are we talking about when I talk about history and the power that's in history? First and foremost, history is not neutral. Okay. It is about controlling the narrative. It's about the past. It is about the present. But most importantly, this historical understanding is about what we begin to talk about, not just today, but like 10 years down the road, 15, 20, a decade down the road, a century? What's the story that's going to be told? And the power in the history is going to be governed by what we say. That is why there's such a concentrated, concerted effort to erase. And I used to think it wasn't about erasure, but it is. It really is about erasing the pieces of American history that folks don't want kids, adults to remember and kids to learn. They want to have a story about this country that is incomplete. When I was in the classroom, and kids would come up to my students would come up to me and tell me, "Oh, Miss Marshall, something happened, something happened." I would ask them for three things. I would ask them for their side. I would ask them for the other person's side. But then I would say, well, then tell me what side the truth lies on. And this is about making sure that the truth is elevated, not just one side or the other. So the power in history is the power to dictate the storyline. And so history really is a battleground because of the inherent power that's in it. And I want to draw your attention to some historical shifts that have always been a fiber, I shall say. It's a weave in the American construct and how we see things. I'm going to blow this particular slide up so you can see it more. I want to highlight a few errors, a few timetables in the American cycle so that you can really, really see why there's such a concentrated effort and a real force to undo what really has been done in this country. So the first era I want to talk about is the antebellum area, the pre 1865, that area before, ante as the prefix meaning before, that antebellum South, that antebellum period. And then one thing I want to focus on is literacy. You do not get the power in history without being literate. Literacy is a dynamic force in understanding the constructs and understanding the connections and understanding the context of any era in which we find ourselves. My pastor always makes this statement when he's about to deliver a message. He says, "I want to give you the context before I give you the content." And if we are not literate, if we are not truly building a literate society, having the context is going to really impact the degree to which the content is going to make any sense. And so in the antebellum period, I know, and hope you're knowing, and maybe you're learning now, the criminalization of Black literacy. Enslaved people were not allowed to read or write. They just weren't. And it wasn't because reading in and of itself was bad. It was because the owners of human beings understood what happens with a literate person. Frederick Douglass was caught saying, well, he wasn't caught saying, but Frederick Douglass is known to have made the statement that once he learned how to read, he was unfit to be a slave. Because when you are literate, your mind becomes your own. You walk in the agency that is inherent to all human beings. And so when enslaved people were caught being taught how to read or found out that they knew how to read, there were life and death consequences to that. People being caught teaching enslaved people how to read faced murder, faced criminalization, particularly if you were an enslaved person and you were found teaching another enslaved person how to read, you were surely in danger of your life being taken from you. Whipped, you could have been, as a woman, faced atrocities that women normally face. And if you were a person who was white and you were caught teaching an enslaved person how to read, you would face your own set of issues and your own set of consequences that would jeopardize your own safety. And so we move out of that period and we move into Reconstruction, right? The Black education period expands. We become one of the fastest, or if not the fastest group of people to become literate. Huge. It is unheard of because our Black people, Black formerly enslaved people, understood that the power in literacy was the power to direct their own lives. And that was huge. So what did they do? They developed their own freedmen schools. Black colleges were established. During that time, you see the requisite backlash, though, because the advancement of a people who are believed to be subhuman, not human, inferior intellectually and socially and from through their humanity, whenever that group begins to make advancements, there is always the related and the concomitant backlash that goes with it. So in this time of the freedmen schools popping up and churches and Black formerly enslaved people creating their own communities and building their churches and building their own institutions, they were met with literacy tests, literacy laws, intense segregation laws, and the KKK begins to emerge as a force to push this group, a group from which my ancestors are part, back into a subjugated space. And of course, this is quick, and I'm not giving you all the information, but I want to make sure that you get what's happening and the power in the history that is being removed cannot be removed. It must not be removed. And so we really want to share some of this. And so, then we move into the post-World War II era, right? There's a significant event that happens to stabilize the country after World War II. And the president of that time signs into legislation the GI Bill. But what happens is the GI Bill becomes law at the expense of Black people being able to really benefit to the same degree that our white community was able to benefit. The president was able to get that passed as long as Black people were not able to benefit and enjoy the fine. I took my time to pause for a moment because I really want to get my words right. We were not able to enjoy the financial benefits that led to tremendous wealth building. And that is huge. But what happened? Our Black veterans were denied benefits. We had a deepening of the racial wealth gap. And some would say that probably was sort of the beginning, but then the explosion of it because we could not access the funds in the same way. But what did we do? We continued to build literacy practices that kept our community together. The power in our history as literate people rests that when there is a backlash to our growth and our advancement, we always decide on our own to exercise our agency for our full advancement and our full empowerment. So then we get the civil rights movement. And a lot of us know what's happening in the civil rights movement. Education and voting rights are expanded. But the backlash, mass incarceration, law and order policies, schools get defunded. And that is the place where we find ourselves back in, right? And so right now, we're in this modern era and doesn't feel really modern to me. I don't know if it feels modern to you, but I feel like I'm living in an era that my mom, who is 80 years old, lived in. And while she lived in an insular community, I don't live in an insular community. So I, at some level, feel probably not quite as safe as she may have felt in her time, 75 years ago. But what do we have? What are some our key events now? We have attacks on our history. We've got our civil liberties are being rolled back. We have civil rights legislation being undone. We have book bans. We have curricular and instructional restriction, not just curtailment, full out restriction. And what does that mean? That means that as history moves forward, the power in it is going to be concentrated to a narrow swath of our community. This power in history cannot be diminished and it cannot be made light of. Our story, as the American story, is, as Eddie Glaude Jr. says, it's not unique per se, but it is dynamic in ways that other societies are not. And this constant push to roll back and this constant push to ensure a single voice is categorically damaging. And it's something that any person, particularly those of us who claim ourselves as members of the education industry and profession, we have a unique responsibility and we have a unique charge, real charge, to make sure that the power in history remains the power of a variety of voices, of a completeness of the history. So let's keep talking about this and what do we mean? So the historical power in literary agency. You've heard me talk about agency before. Agency is this ability to really make informed decisions about your own advancement, to make decisions that are in your best interest. And I'm going to focus this segment of our conversation on Black literary societies that, you know what, we might want to think about bringing back in a much more direct and specific way. So, what were some of the ways in which those societies worked? We had the antebellum, that word again, antebellum reading groups, right? That they would find spaces in the forest. They would find spaces, dig ditches. They were serious about learning how to read and be literate. They understood the fact that being literate must be important because a whole lot of people were trying to make sure that they couldn't do it. And so these reading circles really were about circumventing and going around the institutional barriers that were set before them. And then we have the post-Civil War Freedmen's School that once enslavement had ended and Black people began to move into their own communities, one of the first things they established two things, a church and a school. And sometimes the church was a school and the school was a church. They took the intellectual development of the community as paramount. It was chief duties. It was priority. We must learn to read. And when they were in these freedmen schools, they were developing deep level, high level literacy practices. The practice of analysis, the practice of critique, the practice of collaboration, the practice of looking through an evaluative lens and then making sure that not just they as an individual, but as the community as a whole was able to ensure full understanding of what was happening. You know, we talk about real world application. They spent time thinking about and crafting responses to the world around them. And then as we move forward in the world, we get actual Black literary societies. You may have heard about them in the Harlem Renaissance, where there are groups, women's groups and men's groups, really coming together to build targeted literary societies. They would get together and they would read books, mostly nonfiction books, but really learning about highbrow literary practices, right? The Socratic method, coming together to build a society within a society that is strong, that defies the barriers, that understands that being literate is critical to survival. And then we have the civil rights movement, and we move into the modern era where this continues, right? Where the activism of literacy development is again paramount. It is ongoing. It is a thing that continues to happen. And we find ourselves in this space again, where leaning into literary societies might just be the way to go to protect ourselves, that we do not allow ourselves to be erased, that we do not allow ourselves to be pushed out of the story of America. We want every person in this country deserves a full and complete story of the United States. They just do. We all do. We deserve to know who our country is, how our country came to be. And it isn't that we want to say everything was bad about our country. That would be a falsehood, because there's some really good things that happen. And yet at the same time, our country came about through some very ugly, ugly ways. And that is necessary too. If our country is ever to be what we say we are on paper, it is crucial that we stop this erasure. So what can you do to reclaim the power that's in history? Number one thing, read and teach the histories they want to erase. Tough. I get it. It's hard, particularly when you're in a classroom and your livelihood is tied to someone else's decision. But just like those enslaved people did, their life was tied up in someone else's decision. And we have to decide that fear will not be the force that drives our actions. We have to be willing to do the hard thing that people don't want us to do. Challenge misinformation and speak up. You have the opportunity. Knowledge, we live in the information age. Speaking up against what you know is inaccurate is what every student deserves. It is paramount to an excellent education. So reach and read and teach. Read and teach what they want hidden. Find what they want hidden. Ask yourself, if they're going to these many lengths to take things out, I want to find out what that is and speak up. Next, build or join a Black literary circle. I think I might think about that my own self. That's a challenge to me. Going back into that practice, right? Create a reading group. Think about what it would look like, right? Engage in intergenerational learning, right? Use social media. We live on social media. Live in the social media space where you can create these spaces, these agentic spaces where people are learning together, where people are reading together, where people are moving past the pressure to push out people. We want to move past that, right? We don't want people pushed out. We want people pushed in, right? Connect history and policy and action. The power in all of this is context. Remember, I said we want to give the context before we get the content. The context is critical. These laws that are coming out right now are contextually driven. And to remove the context means it becomes easier to push out the kind of content that we instinctively know is inaccurate and harmful. And then last, make history personal. Own your narrative. What is your narrative? Take time to research your own family and community history. Document and share stories of resilience. Use history as a blueprint for resistance. The power in history is in the power that it allows for us to move forward with. And that is something that they can never erase. As much as they try, the power in history is that it leaves the breadcrumbs. We can follow, we can learn, we can really, really take back this power and do the things that our students deserve. We're educators. And I talk about power in education because there is power in education. I talk about that because it matters. It is critical and it is crucial to the wholesale development of a literate populace. Many, many years ago, when I was in the classroom, I used 1984 and Animal Farm as a tool or tools to advance critical thought and analysis. And one of the things that we remember the most in 1984 is the last piece of it where Winston finally gives in. He finally gives in to the 2 + 2 = 5. He had been fighting and fighting and fighting. And finally he said, hands up, I'm done. He stopped fighting and he came to decide that 2 + 2 = 5. My challenge and my charge is to not give in. 2 + 2 is 4. 2 + 2 = 4. And it's really critical that we recognize the power that rests in history, the power to help us create the America that is on paper, the truths that we hold as self-evident, as the equality of every person, right? To pursue their dreams. We love to say that we are a nation of laws and we are the beacon and we are the example. Well, you have to be the example at home before you can be the example elsewhere. So the power in history is the power to push and challenge. And I want to thank you for that. And want to let you rest with this last statement. Power is in history, and history equals power. I want you to claim it. I want you to use it, and I want you to teach it. And I thank you for that, for your time today. I really want to just give you a couple of more reminders. I will be back next week. And next week, we're going to talk about the foundations of public education. And I trust you, well, trust me, it is not what you were taught. There's my cliffhanger on that. So, do you have a copy of the book? I'm going to put it out there again. I want to give you some information about, actually, I'll make the slide even bigger for you. Get the copy. There is a QR code right there. But if you want a signed copy of this book, please go to liaisoneducationalpartners.org and click on the books tab. You'll see the books tab. It'll take you to a link that will allow you to get a copy of this book that I will sign for you. And then want to also say, hey, last week I talked about this. I am thrilled, so excited. My Power Shift Experience 4-week course on power. It's a blueprint for understanding your instructional power. Registration is open. There's a QR code. It is there. Please register. It will change your life. 4 weeks, 2 hours each week of live instruction, plus a private community where we're going to get together and share our ideas. If you want to really revolutionize the quality of your culture, you will sign up and register for that. And then let's just keep talking. Would love to chat with you. If you want to know more about the work I do and how I can support you, there is a way for you to do that. The QR code is there for you. And I will see you next week. Thank you for your time today. Have a thankful Thursday. And remember, the power is in history. Use it, teach it.